Let's paint the Soulblight models in Grimdark style today.
That the entirety of the cosmos is accessible through each and every individual's mind, connecting to the great mind, the great spirit.
Welcome back to the Studio Collectors. Thank you all so much for your wonderful support for our ultimate Soulblight painting video. Right here at Kolectiv Studios, we strive to create better content so that you can paint up your miniatures more quickly and even more beautifully. I'm Kenneth and I'll be your guide for this video today. In this video, we are going to be taking a slight detour from our usual bright and colourful paint jobs such as Radukar and many of our Cursed City miniatures. Today I'll be using Radukar the Beast and I'll be showing you guys how to paint vampires in a Grimdark style, and I'll also be sharing some tips and tricks of how you can add additional blood and gore effects to your models. As usual, we have organized this video to easy to watch chapters, so if you're looking for a particular chapter, you can just skip on ahead. So for this video, these are the chapters that you might want to apply for your miniatures. Foundation: Pale Undead Flesh, Dirty White Hair, NMM Tarnished Silver, NMM Brass, Black Fur, Muscle Fibers, Gore Effects, and lastly, the environment. So using the chapters that I have just mentioned, you can definitely paint up your Vicross models in this very Grimdark style. In all the colors that I will be using in this video, I will also be recommending some GW alternatives so that it's easy to follow along. So just a little bit of preamble, I would like to talk about how I'm going to be approaching Radukar the Beast. So if you're looking for the painting chapters, why don't you just skip on to the next chapter, which is the foundation chapter, and that will cover how I establish the mood and the environment of this miniature. In this miniature, I wanted to set the mood where Radukar has been just defeated by the heroes of He's really angry and really beastly and looking for his next prey around Uffenkan the As such, I wanted to create a dreary mood, hence I didn't use any of my saturated colors like what you have seen on Radukar and many of my Cursed City models. For this entire project, I started off using a really desaturated palette, and the idea is to have a warm, hot forest with many olive greens, browns and reds as the base colors. So that's the plan, and eventually I want to move up to cooler colors to illustrate the cool moonlight where he's hunting his next prey. These are my broad strategies when approaching these pieces, and I'm going to be using Radukar in sub-assemblies before I paint up this miniature. So without further ado, let's go on to the foundation stage of this tutorial. Welcome to the foundation chapter of this tutorial. In this stage, I'll be using the airbrush to quickly lay down some base colors, and this will set the mood and environment for Radukar the Beast. As mentioned in the previous chapter, this will be used to set the mood of the warm, dreary forest that Radukar is currently hunting in. And eventually I'll be moving on to cooler highlights. For this stage, you're going to be needing these colors right here. Alternatively, these are the GW colors that you can use to substitute any of my colors. So for this stage, I'm going to be using an airbrush. If you don't have an airbrush, don't worry because we have a tutorial of how you can achieve this stage using the overbrush method. You can check out our how to paint Radukar video, links will be in the description below. So let's stop dawdling and let's get the foundations painted right now. Alright, so right here we have the model primed in black. Whoops, there goes the sycophant. Okay, right here we are using AK Gen 3 Deep Brown. Or you can also use, alternatively, Games Workshop Montfang Brown. Okay, I just want to produce a brownish tone, eventually creating a good transition towards a warm green. So this warm brown and warm green will set the tone for the rest of the model. Alright, here we are, Radukar the Beast. Okay, so now I'm using AK Gen 3 Olive Green. I'm going to do this all over the model, and I'm going to make sure that this goes into all the crevices of Radukar the Beast. Okay, so alternatively you can use Games Workshop Elysian Green. I find that this is a pretty good substitute for this color, and you want to do this as liberally as possible, and this is the final result. Okay, so moving on, I'm gonna be using AK Gen 3 Pastel Green to do the final highlights. It's sort of like a zenithal. And right here, I'm gonna be using AK Gen 3 Burn Red to do the glows on the eyes. You can alternatively use Games Workshop Mephiston Red. Let's do this really slowly, and don't worry if you spray out of the area. Okay, so now I'm going back with this AK Gen 3 Ivory to spray on the highest highlights. In the Games Workshop case, you could probably use Screaming Skull mixed in with a little bit of White Scar. Alright, so I'm gonna be creating the warm glow coming from the bottom. Currently I'm using AK Gen 3 Burn Red to do this yet again. And alternatively, you can use Games Workshop Mephiston Red to establish the red glow coming from behind him. Moving on, I'm going to do a more detailed and more focused glow. I'm using AK Gen 3 Deep Red, and you can use Games Workshop Evil Sun Scarlet in this case. So just doing this pretty liberally and directionally. And this is the foundation stage of Radukar the Beast. So now that we have laid down the foundations, we are going to go on to the next chapter, which we will be covering how to paint pale undead flesh. So the topic covered in this chapter can be used for other undead miniatures in this Soulblight range, namely Belladama, Lady Annika, Kritza, and many others. This color scheme of painting is slightly different from how I painted Laukervai because Laukervai is looking a little bit more graceful and poised, whereas Radukar and the rest of the Vicross are really beastly and savage. So as such, we're going on with a very warm base to illustrate this beastly nature of what the Vicross are. Whereas in Laukervai's skin tone, it is the opposite where I use a really cool skin tone and use a warm highlight to illustrate that. So in order to paint the pale undead skin tone, I will be using these colors right here. And alternatively, if you don't have any of my colors, you can substitute it with the GW colors mentioned right here. Alright, enough talking about colors, let's get painting the pale undead flesh right now. Okay, so I'm going to start off with a GW Atonian camo shade, and I'm going to do this all over the flesh areas. I find that this helps me identify the areas that I need to paint, and it also makes the volumes a lot more clear. Sometimes the volumes are very subtly sculpted and you can't really tell, and I find that a nice wash helps this stage. So moving on, what I've done is I've mixed in AK Gen 3 Salmon mixed in with AK Gen 3 Neutral Grey. So this creates a very desaturated pinkish tone, which I find very good to contrast the green tone that I've painted just prior to this. So what you can do here is gradually add in a little bit more AK Gen 3 Salmon to slowly start to increase the pinkness of the flesh, because you want the mid-tone to register as more pink. You can just gradually also add in GW Bachmann Glow. Now right here I'm adding in more and more grey. So now we are moving more into the highlights. I like to bring your attention to this because the grey that I'm adding in is kind of neutral. However, look, it's registering as a little bit of blue. So you can see that the warm colors that I've used prior to this is creating the effect that the skin is slowly appearing more blue in this blue moonlight that I'm working on. Okay, so now we are just adding in more and more medium grey in. So and moving on to the final highlights in just a little bit. Right here, what you can see is I'm doing a very scratchy technique, and this scratchy technique creates a very uneven texture, and it allows the skin to look a lot more realistic and method down in my opinion. Doing the exact same steps for the legs. So you can see this multiple layers of scratching and scratching really creates a very nice texture. So moving on, I'm moving into the high highlights now, and I'm using AK Gen 3 Greenish White. I find that this really allows me to create contrast because I'm going from warm to cool. And from the grey, I wanted the white not to be completely desaturated. That's why I'm adding in a little bit of this greenish white as a highlight color, rather than just using ivory or pure white. You could use ivory, but I wanted something a bit cooler, so I used greenish white to replace this. So right here, I'm gonna be using Games Workshop Raglan Flash Shade, and I'm just doing some stippling of this. This creates the paw marks, as you can see on the side of the head. It creates some degree of detail and complexity to show that his skin is kind of aged and not well maintained. Right here, I'm going to be going down with a glaze of Games Workshop Caramel Crimson in all the key areas that the blood vessels will be in. So it's like the joints, the knees, the elbows, the cheeks and the nose. This is a usual step that I do in many of my tutorials. I find that this creates good variation of the skin tone. So now that the pale undead flesh is done, we're going to move on to the next chapter where we'll cover how to paint his dirty white hair. Don't worry, this is going to be a really short chapter, and I'm just going to talk to you about some tips of how I painted his white hair. I substituted the colors to make Radukar look older from the box art so that he looks even more BC. So for this stage, you're going to need these colors right here. And as normal, alternatively, the GW colors have also been mentioned. Okay, let's get these colors ready and let's paint his dirty white hair on Radukar the Beast right now. So in order to paint the dirty white hair, right here I'm going to be base coating the entire beard and hair in AK Gen 3 Deep Brown. Alternatively, you can be using Games Workshop Bonfang Brown for this stage. The colors are not really that important, you can just use approximations because what's more important is the highlight placements. Alright, so moving on, I've added in a little bit of AK Gen 3 Deck 10 into the deep brown. You can be mixing in a little bit of Games Workshop Ushakti Bone for this stage. Right here, one important thing while highlighting the hair and beard is that you want to be highlighting it in volumes rather than the individual sculpted details, because if you highlighted it based on the details, it will look really weird and wouldn't look luscious at all. I will be explaining this a lot more in the later stages where I'm been painting the black fur on Radukar the Beast. Okay, so within these highlights, I'm adding in a little bit of AK Gen 3 Ivory. And you can be using Games Workshop Screaming Skull to substitute this color. Now that the organic parts of Radukar has been painted, we're going to move on to his armor panels. In this chapter, we'll be covering how to paint Tarnished NMM Silver on Radukar the Beast. So in the story, I would assume that Radukar's armor is scavenged, put together, and does not have much maintenance. For this stage, I'll be heavily relying on the wash to showcase the different types of sediment built on this silver armor. And you'll be needing these colors right here. Okay, and the GW alternatives are also listed right here now. And let's get painting the Tarnished NMM Silver right now. Alright, so we're going to work on the Tarnished Silver here. And for the first stage, I'm going to be using AK Gen 3 French Blue, mixed in with a little bit of AK Gen 3 Neutral Grey. This is to slightly desaturate the colors and to create this cooler tone. For those Games Workshop users out there, what you can do is you can be using the Fang mixed in with a little bit of Dawnstone, and this will give a pretty similar effect. So right here, gradually I'm adding in a little bit of AK Gen 3 medium grey into the existing mix. This will create a pretty nice grey mid-tone for the silver highlights to sit upon. What you can do for this stage is you can also be using Games Workshop Administratum Grey for this stage. Gradually I'm adding in AK Gen 3 medium grey, and with a little bit of a twist I'm adding in a little bit of AK Gen 3 olive green, just a touch of it to sort of warm up and contrast against the blue mid-tone that we have just created. So right here you can see me trying to create a warm transition and contrast compared to the mid-tone. Okay, so right here I'm kind of just washing the shadows down. I'm using Games Workshop Atonian Camo Shade right here. So you just want to focus on the areas that will be darker, and this will create a more saturated shadow and it creates deeper shadows as well. Okay, so moving on to pure medium grey from AK Gen 3, I'm going to be just edging and highlighting the details. Right here, I'm also adding in a little bit of AK Gen 3 Ivory, and these colors you can substitute with Administratum Grey and Screaming Skull from Games Workshop. Now that the NMM silver is done, we're going to move on to the next chapter where we'll be painting Radukar's non-metallic metal brass. For this stage, I want to bring to your attention that since the silver has already been painted, the highlight placement of the non-metallic brass has to be coherent with how you place the highlights on the non-metallic silver. So for this stage, these are the colors that you'll be needing, and the GW alternatives have also been listed here. And let's paint the non-metallic metal brass on Radukar the Beast right now. Okay, first and foremost, I'm going to be base coating these brass areas using AK Gen 3 Deep Brown. What you can do is you can substitute this for Games Workshop Montfang Brown. Just want to create a smooth and even base coat, so just do this stage neatly so that you don't undo any of the hard work you've done on the silver previously. Okay, so moving on, I'm gradually adding in a little bit of AK Gen 3 Green Brown into the mix. So this creates this orangey mid-tone that we can use for the brass. Alternatively, what I will recommend is you can use Games Workshop Gravelord Brown to achieve this similar effect with Montfang Brown. Do this really slowly, and for me what I'm doing is I'm doing this scratching technique so that I can showcase the volumes and textures. So just gradually adding more and more of the green brown in. I'm also adding in a little bit of AK Gen 3 Ivory into this to start to create the initial highlights. Remember, when you are highlighting the brass, don't just highlight the colors, remember about the shapes necessary and take note of the shapes that I'm highlighting. Now that the metallic surfaces are done, we're going to finish up the next big surface of Radukar where he has the wolf fur. I'm going to be painting the fur black as this is kind of like a color swap scheme of Radukar, and one major gripe I have about fur is that they tend to be quite over sculpted. So if you go with the usual method of base, wash and highlight, the fur tends to be very hard. So what I want to achieve is I want to achieve supple looking fur. This tip that I'm covering while painting fur can also be used for painting hair, as you need to paint the entire thing as a volume. I'll be swapping my brush to a fine tip brush right here, and you're going to need to prepare this brush in order to do this stage. So for this chapter, you're going to need these colors right here, and these are the GW alternatives that I've listed. Okay, so let's start painting the supple black fur on Radukar the Beast right now. Okay, so right here I'm base coating the black fur in AK Gen 3 Smoke Black. I really like how smooth and matte the finish will be on this paint. Alternatively, you can use Games Workshop Abaddon Black. gradually into this mix, I'm adding in a little bit of AK Gen 3 Neutral Grey. Alternative color for this would be Games Workshop Dawnstone. Just add it sparingly and try to create a very dark grey. So as I mentioned about hairs, you don't want to just paint the sculpted detail. You want to paint them sort of like a stippling method. So right here what I'm doing is I'm stippling down the highlights that I mentioned in the previous color and just drawing out the little hair fibers. Right here I've added in a little bit of AK Gen 3 Ivory, just a touch of this. And right here what you can see is I'm highlighting the hairs as a volume rather than the individual sculpted details. I'm just drawing in the sculpts so that it creates individual textures. So as you can see, gradually I'm adding more and more of the ivory and it creates this really lush fur looking effect. So now that the black fur is done, we're going to move on to little details on Radukar. Radukar's model has been sculpted with sort of tattoo looking like runes, but then I want to up the ante a little bit and I want to paint these as exposed flesh. I'm approaching this chapter like how I've done my Attack on Titan Gargant, and I'll be painting individual muscle fibers to showcase the exposed flesh of Radukar. Similarly, you're going to need a very fine tip brush, so get that ready. And these are the colors that you'll be needing for this stage. And these are the GW alternatives that I recommend. So let's get these colors ready and let's start painting the muscle fibers on Radukar the Beast. So right here, we are going to start with the base coats. Just do this carefully and try not to get it on the skin that you have painted on at the first stage. Currently, I'm using AK Gen 3 burn rate to establish this result, and alternatively you can use Games Workshop Mephiston rate to do this. Just do this as neatly as possible, just take your time. So now I've started drawing in the muscle fibers. I'm currently using AK Gen 3 deep red, or you can use Games Workshop Eversun Scarlet and draw this really fine, and this really adds on a lot of texture. Okay, so I'm just using the deep red to continue to draw the muscle fibers. So what's happening gradually, I'm adding in more and more AK Gen 3 salmon on top of the deep red that we have just used previously. What you can do if you are using Games Workshop is just add in a little bit at a time of Kislev flesh. So now this is pure salmon. I'm just drawing more lines in, and alternatively sometimes you can do some dots to emulate the shine coming out from already exposed muscle. For Games Workshop, just keep adding in a little bit of Kislev flesh until you get this pinkish looking final tone. Okay, so right here I'm going to be using AK Gen 3 Deck 10 plus a little bit of ivory to highlight the edges where his skin are exposed to the wound. You find that edge highlighting really adds a lot of detail, and I like it a lot. So right here I'm going to be using a wash of Games Workshop Caribou Crimson. I find that this wash helps tie down the entire model and this surface together so that none of the blends and none of the stippling will look too rough when viewed by a viewer up close. Now that we've painted up the muscle fibers, we're going to use the similar colors to paint up the gore effects on Radukar the Beast in this chapter. This tip is particularly useful if you are painting up brutal looking miniatures. In Radukar the Beast, I'm going to be adding this gore effects around his mouth and on his claws. This sort of signifies that he has killed his prey with his hands and he has been drinking their blood very ferociously. Also in this chapter, I'll be covering how to paint the blood dripping from his hands as transparent liquid, so you don't want to miss that out. For this stage, I'm going to be using these colors here. And these are the GW alternatives that you'll be needing. If you don't have these colors, you can always just mix them up. Okay, so let's get started painting the gore effects on Radukar the Beast right now. So right here, I'm going to be using a frayed brush. And I'm just going to be stippling down a very thin down version of AK Gen 3 Burn Red. Alternatively, you can just stipple on Mephiston Red from Games Workshop. Because it's thinned down very thin, you can see that building up several layers allows you to create this gore effect without it looking too neat. So right now we're going to be painting up the dripping blood from Radukar's hand. Currently I'm just base coating this in AK Gen 3 Burn Red. So right here I'm going to be adding the shine coming from the underneath of this dripping blood. Apologize for this not being in focus, but currently I'm using AK Gen 3 Deep Red. So I'm going to paint this blood drips out like a gem, so it gives the extra level of life and dynamicness, so the model looks even more detailed. I'm going to be using pure white from AK Gen 3, and you can use white scar to substitute this. Just pick up the areas where the strongest shines will be. Now that the gore effects are done, I'm going to just quickly breeze through the rest of the miniature, painting up the environment, painting up his sycophants with the red OSL eye glows, and I'm going to finish up the models. For this chapter, it is not specific to any material, however you can use many of these techniques that I've used before onto this stage. So therefore this stage is going to be really brisk and really quick. So for this stage, I use these colors right here. These are the GW alternatives that I recommend. Just mix the colors up if you don't have them, and let's finish up the dreary wood of this Grimdark Radukar right now. So I'm just going to blitz through the stages. I'm going to be following the exact same tutorials that I've done for the sword using the silver tutorial that I mentioned just now. As for the sycophant skin, I'm going to be using the same technique and the same paints that I've used for Radukar skin. I'm just going to be using a little bit more of the Tonian camo shade to tint it a bit more greenish. And as for the red, I've done it the same. And right here, I'm highlighting the bottom edges using AK Gen 3 Deep Red. I find that this adds a lot of luminosity and picks out some small details. So you just want to pick out some of the little underlying details so that when the model rotates around, you can see this red glow. Okay, so similarly, I'm gonna be putting on the red glow on the front sycophant's eyes as well as his armor. So now I'm gonna be painting in the lock. I'm going to make the lock look like it has been mossy. So the colors I use for this stage is gunship green and pale blue. You can always substitute this with some similar GW colors such as Elysian green and add it in with a little bit of Transition grey. Okay, I'm just using pure black there just to paint in the cast shadows. It might look a little bit weird here, but when you see in the photographs, this will look a lot more natural. You're just picking on the edge highlights by gradually adding in a little bit of pale blue. And this is the lock done. Okay, so now I'm going to be using AK's texture paste. It is AK Dark Earth. I'm going to be using this to fill up the groundwork. Going to keep it really simple, and going to be using this a little bit on the mound that Radukar is standing on too. Okay, just going to put it on the mound that he's standing on too, so that I can fill in the gaps that I didn't fix previously during the assembly stage. So right here, what I've done is I've added in a little bit of pale blue mixed in with saddle brown and a little bit of burnt red. For Games Workshop, I think the closest color you can use Steel Legion Drab, and I think this makes a really good highlight for this. Just picking up the skulls a little bit, and I'm gonna be using that pan mixed in with a little bit of green brown. For Games Workshop, I would recommend using just a regular old Ushakti bone because it's fast and convenient. And yeah, so I'm just gonna do this in a scratchy method. So now that we've base coated the skulls, I'm just gonna wash down the skulls using Atonian Camo Shade. You can see that this is a very recurring theme around the entire model because Atonian Camo Shade seems to be the bonding color for everything else. Okay, just cleaning up the exposed earth with the previous mix that I've used. So the previous mix that I've used to make up Steel Legion Drab, you can use this right here too. The colors will be listed on the top left hand corner. Just doing an overbrush, picking up the textures and creating the colors and the layers and the complexity that you need to showcase that there is some moonlight. Just do remember that these colors are just suggestions. You can always try to make something similar and you can achieve this. Then lastly, I'm going back with a wash of Atonian Camo Shade at the edges to give it some central spotlight focus in the front. Gonna be painting this into the ambient occlusion areas of the lock. Just gonna push everything in place. And now I'm just gonna be doing some gore effects on the sword. The gore effects are the same way that I've done them on Radukar's hand. So I've been using deep red watered down and just stippling it all over the face and the sword. And after that, just stipple on some thinned down Caribou Crimson and you've got some gory parts done. Looking super Grimdark already. So now I'm just finishing off the outside of the base using Caribou Crimson, just to create the darkest colors and to tie everything down with this red environment light that I painted for Radukar. At the same time, I'm just very lightly stippling this all over his exposed limbs, and yeah. There we have it, the Grimdark Radukar the Beast has been painted, and this is the final result. I also really like how I added this little red glow to tie in this miniature with the rest of the Curse City models that I painted last month. So thank you all for watching all the way to the end. Remember that this tutorial can be used to paint many of the Soulblight Vicross miniatures that Games Workshop has recently launched. Do tag me on Instagram at KolectivSG if you would like me to take a look at your work or even possibly comment on them. I'd like to thank all my patrons for allowing me to do this, and if you could, give me a like and subscribe because it really helps me and keeps the lights on, allows me to keep producing tutorials such as these so that I can share my knowledge and information with all you guys. Thank you once again to my patrons, and if you want to support me even further, head on to the Patreon and get a whole slew of painting tutorials. Thank you guys for watching all the way to the end, it means a lot to me, and I hope to see you in the next painting video, which is Lord Crow. See you guys then.